Hello and welcome to Star USA Training. Today is Tuesday, December 13th, and we'll be talking about forced labor and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, also known as UFLPA. We'll look at the underlying frameworks and responsibilities, some mechanisms for adhering to and instituting compliance, both with customs and with your own organizations, and close with some takeaways as well as hopefully answering your questions. We are recording this webinar. The slides in the recording and all other materials will be made available after the broadcast. All participants are going to be muted, but the Q&A feature is available if you have questions. We strongly encourage you to post your questions as we go throughout. There'll be time at the end for me to answer those. And the closed captions are turned on. For individuals having difficulty with the automated closed captioning transcriptions, please feel free to contact us via train@starusa.org after the webinar, and we'll be more than happy to help you understand the material. There's a glut of initialisms and acronyms in international trade. I tend to talk very quickly, and this stuff can be confusing all by itself without needing to rely on automated transcription. So our teams are more than happy to help assist you in understanding. And lastly, there is one CCS credit available. Please email train@starusa.org after the webinar with your NCBFAA ID number, and we'll be able to get that put through for you. Okay, a little bit of background on who we are. Star USA is a trade and compliance consulting, advice, training, and services company. We tackle all the things that you can see on the slide there, but basically we specialize in taking on problems and forming a plan of action that will help move your business forward. We're really good at seeing the forest for the trees and developing a strategy that actually works. Some background on me. I have my customs broker's license, and I've been in the international trade compliance business for almost 20 years. During that time, I've worked with clients of pretty much every scope and size across most industries, and traveled to, I think, 5 continents for work. So I've been around the block, and hopefully today we'll be able to take a look at a relatively new development in the trade compliance universe, the Forced Labor and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So first, we're going to talk about some of the frameworks that have led us to where we are today and understand how they came to be and what is in place today so that we can kind of develop strategies that help us deal with the current state and prepare for the future. Forced labor has been a major global issue for a very, very long time as far as human history goes back, but modern slavery has been growing in recent years. Forced labor occurs when individuals are compelled against their will to provide work or service through force, fraud, or coercion. Victims can be any age, race, religious affiliation, gender identity, nationality, or socioeconomic group. Some of the risk factors put forward by the International Labor Organization are unstable immigration status, language barriers, poverty and lack of basic needs, recent or past traumas, lack of social systems, physical or developmental disabilities. These are key indicators to be paying attention to when looking at forced labor in modern slavery on a global scale. Additionally, in the US, we have our own approach to this problem that's been increasing over the last 5 years directly. US has a focus on human trafficking and forced labor. The US Department of Homeland Security instituted the Blue Campaign in 2010. The Blue Campaign is a national public awareness campaign designed to educate the public, law enforcement, and industry partners on how to recognize indicators of human trafficking and how to respond to possible cases. This program, in conjunction with several other federal and other global agencies and independent organizations, have been working aggressively to raise awareness on the impacts of human trafficking, of forced labor, of child labor, and the devastating impact that it has on the global economy, on individuals, and everywhere in between. CBP, as an agency of the Department of Homeland Security, is tasked with implementing Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 through the Withhold Release Orders, WROs, to prevent merchandise produced in whole or in part with forced labor from being imported into the United States. So as we kind of progress through the global awareness down to US laws and current regulations, we see that CBP is currently tasked with that responsibility to prevent the introduction of materials produced with forced labor from entering the US from outside. UFLPA is one of the most public and impactful national policy changes the US has implemented to date, and we are seeing a wide range of impacts. We are expecting to see a lot of other governments around the world instituting similar policies if they have not yet already, and we'll have links throughout the slides to some of those other programs and some of the pieces that other organizations at the UN level, at independent organization level, there'll be some resources for you to kind of look into afterwards. So the U.S. legal framework against forced labor, it's important to understand the impetus behind the new laws and regulations and how the rules came to be. And enforcement in the U.S. has been moving forward, although you'll see from this timescale that it's not very rapid until recently. The Tariff Act of 1930 has always prohibited the importing of any product that was mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor, including forced or indentured child labor. So since 1930, we've had a rule on the books against the importation of products produced with forced labor. However, that same Tariff Act of 1930 included a consumptive demand exception, which stated, "But in no case shall such provision be applicable to goods, wares, articles, or merchandise so mined or produced or manufactured, who are not mined, produced, or manufactured in such quantities in the United States as to meet the consumptive demand of the United States." Effectively, this was a giant loophole in what was allowed to be brought into the country because the onus was on the federal agencies to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these goods were produced with forced labor. And this loophole allowed the claim that there was not enough U.S. production to meet U.S. demand, so that the goods had to be imported. So this loophole has been in place since 1930 until 2015, when the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, TFTIA, as it's called colloquially, TFTIA was passed in 2015, took effect in 2016. In addition to modernizing drawback and tackling some AD/CVD rules, it also closed the loophole on that consumptive demand clause. It repealed that clause from the 1930 Tariff Act. So when TFTIA was passed, CBP was therefore tasked with closing that loophole and instituting policies that would help prevent the introduction of products produced with forced labor from entering the country. However, CBP was under-equipped to take on that enforcement action. So in 2020, they instituted the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force under TFTIA. The Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is initialized as FLETF, and it was created by executive order in 2020. And through its efforts, it proved the introduction of forced labor from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the XUAR region. And that led to the passage of a law in December of 2021, December of last year, which took effect in June of this year, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is the law that's currently in effect. It took effect in June, and it is the mechanism by which Customs has the authority to seize shipments. In addition to the passing of the UFLPA, Customs is increasing enforcement and targeting. There are CTPAT updates to MSC, Minimum Security Criteria, Section 3.9, where last week they announced in January 2023, they will transition the MSC number 3.9 from a should to a must. That statement is currently CTPAT members should have a documented social compliance program in place that at a minimum addresses how the company ensures goods imported into the United States were not mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part with prohibited forms of labor, for example, forced, imprisoned, indentured, or indentured child labor. So that will become CTPAT members must have a documented social compliance program in place. And that change takes effect in January 23. CBP is also introducing a new postal code verification system in place for when the MID, the Manufacturer Identification Code, on an entry indicates a Chinese country of origin, Chinese postal code will be required on the U.S. Customs entry. Any entries coming through where the postal code indicates an XUAR postal code, which is the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Xinjiang, that will trigger an alert to the filer of the UFLPA restrictions. So the broker that's filing the entry will get an alert. They will pass that on to the importer, indicating that this is a potential UFLPA flagged shipment and that they should take immediate actions as necessary. The social compliance and forced labor components of CTPAT supply chain security are also part of the CTPAT trade compliance currently and increasingly moving forward. So if you're part of the CTPAT trade compliance or the trusted trader program or the importer security or self-assessment program, the ISA program, all kind of the same thing, social compliance and forced labor protections are baked into those as well. So the UFLPA shifted the responsibility paradigm by granting CBP a presumption of non-compliance whenever goods are produced in whole or in part within the XUAR, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, or by an entity on their entity list. They have a presumption of being in violation of the UFLPA, and CBP can seize those goods. They can put them into detention. So it creates a new standard of enforcement for forced labor. Under normal circumstances, CBP would have to establish a reasonable suspicion to withhold those goods, but under UFLPA, that presumption is assumed whenever those goods qualify by that region or by the entity list. Under normal circumstances, an importer would have 3 months to work through any sort of detention order from CBP. Under the UFLPA, you only have 30 days, and the goods may not be moved into a bonded warehouse or into a foreign trade zone like they would be under different forms of detention. I got some history on how WROs, withhold release orders, used to work. They used to be a fairly internal process within CBP. They would be able to flag shipments between headquarters and their field offices as potentially suspicious, and it would trigger the field offices to perform investigations. And they had a relatively low standard of concern, just a reasonable suspicion is all they were targeting. And it was an internal memo. It never actually made it to the importer as it was. If the goods were determined that they needed to be seized or detained, then CBP would trigger the notification to the importer, letting them know that your goods are being detained for these reasons, and here's your resources and your recourses available. Typically, you're allowed to re-export or petition for admissibility into the US, or else abandon the merchandise and customs would destroy them. But with the Trade Enforcement Task Force and the UFLPA, those WROs are now being published in order to raise awareness and enable importers in the trade community to recognize higher risk areas. So they're using public awareness to spur attention to supply chains, and it's having the intended effect. People are paying a closer attention to their supply chains today than they were 2 years ago. In the furtherance of preventing forced labor, that is a very good thing. Now that we have some of the background on what the rules are, how they came to be, and where we stand, let's take a closer look at the scope of UFLPA and what compliance entails for importers. One of the key terms, one of the key things to be aware of is the concept of the rebuttable presumption. The rebuttable presumption was established by the UFLPA, and it states, the importation of any goods, wares, articles, and merchandise mined, produced, or manufactured, wholly or in part, in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the XUAR, of the People's Republic of China, or produced by an entity on the list, is prohibited by Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930, and such goods, wares, articles, and merchandise are not entitled entry into the United States. This is the de facto stance that CBP holds with regard to all goods produced wholly or in part in this region or by an entity on their list. This is not limited to just products shipping directly from the XUAR regions or even just China in general. It includes goods that originated in that region but were sent elsewhere for further processing, whether they're being sent to Thailand or Vietnam or to Australia or to somewhere in the UK. If those goods originated in the XUAR provinces or by an entity on that list, it is considered within the scope of the UFLPA, and those goods are not allowed entry into the United States. Note also that the presumption is not limited only to products directly produced, but also the parties that are identified on the UFLPA entity list. These parties are not necessarily included on the standard restricted party screening lists that are used typically for export control purposes. Those lists are for export, and this is dealing entirely with imports, so those lists don't overlap. And when you use the consolidated screening search on the BIS website, it's not going to include the UFLPA entity list. Some of the other third-party softwares out there might allow you to add the UFLPA list to your screening practices. And if you are screening your suppliers and your vendors as part of your process, that's a good step to take. Although, as we'll see later, it won't be sufficient all by itself. And unlike with Section 301, the supplemental duties on Chinese goods, there is no exclusion for things like substantial transformation or tariff engineering or any other mechanism by which the goods are further manufactured before they come to the US if they contain any good wholly or in part. So any manufactured good that uses components that can be traced back to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that is going to be flagged under the UFLPA and should not be imported, regardless of what degree of further processing it undergoes. So what do you do when your goods are flagged or are suspected to be flagged under UFLPA? You've got two basic options. First one is turn the goods around, don't have them come to the US. If you can return them to origin or divert the shipment so that they never attempt to be entered into the US, then you will not be in violation of the UFLPA and you can deal with the problem a different way. If you do have to have your goods and they are potentially flagged or suspected to be flagged under UFLPA, then your only option is to rebut the rebuttal presumption. Note that if you are going to rebut, you're only going to have 30 days to take action. Usually by diverting the goods or returning them back to origin, you can get yourself extra time to ensure that the goods definitely are or definitely are not compliant with UFLPA and make an informed decision from there rather than scrambling within CBP's timeframes. So if you're going to rebut the rebuttal presumption, the guidance for that is in a law 11778, which is here, a link to it is on the slide as well, which basically states that the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection shall apply the presumption unless the Commissioner determines that the importer of record has fully complied with the guidance described in Section 2D6 and any regulations issued to implement that guidance, and completely and substantively responded to all inquiries for information submitted by the Commissioner to ascertain whether the goods were mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part with forced labor, and by clear and convincing evidence that the good, ware, article, or merchandise was not mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor. Under this guidance, the customs can allow goods that were previously flagged under UFLPA to be permitted entry into the United States. To date, there have been more than 3,600 entries targeted under UFLPA, and as far as I understand, there have been 0 successful rebuttals to UFLPA. I'm not aware of any penalties that have been assessed under the same thing, but none of those shipments have gotten into the United States, the vast majority of which have been actually turned around and shipped back to origin. The key phrase on the left-hand side here is that clear and convincing evidence standard. That is greater than the preponderance of evidence, which is used often in like civil cases, and it's stronger even than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a criminal standard in court cases. So clear and convincing evidence means that there's virtually no way that the goods are potentially linked to the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang or to one of the entities. If CBP grants the rebuttal, if they say that, okay, you've provided enough evidence, they must then submit a report to Congress within 30 days of that granting of that exception and identify the goods and the evidence that was submitted and provide it to Congress for Congress to review. The likelihood of them doing that, just thinking about the people that I know at CBP, people that work for a living, that seems like a pretty high threshold to hit. But if you are going to rebut, the CBP has provided guidance on how to structure and prepare for that rebuttal. So in order to rebut a detention under UFLPA, the importer must provide clear and convincing evidence that the goods are not subject to the UFLPA. Section 4 of the operational guidance for importers lays out some of the factors that they'll be evaluating. Prior to registration for the session, I had questions from Gary in Tampa regarding practical compliance for SME businesses with low exposure to forced labor. Even trade attorneys are not definitive on what the risk and practical compliance would be. And then Gwen from Illinois had a question on documentation for raw materials, and Desiree in Colorado had questions on steps to respond to a notice of detention and information documentation required to respond. All 3 of your questions would be answerable by section 4 here, and going through that with a fine-tooth comb. This is definitely where you would want to start. The answer is that you'll want to include pretty much everything that they enumerate, plus whatever else you can provide to the maximum extent possible. In the operational guidance, they advise that if you're claiming that the goods were not produced in the XUAR region, you should focus on sections B and D, supply chain tracing information, and evidence that they were not traceable back to XUAR. But if you're claiming that forced labor was not used, even if they are traceable back to XUAR, then you could focus on A, B, C, and E, skip the D section. However, I would still make sure that you're reviewing all the sections regardless. Specific steps taken beyond this general guidance is going to be dependent a lot on the type of business you have, the relationship that you have with your suppliers, the documentation that you can furnish, what sort of tracing you can put forward as far down as you can go from there. If you don't have all of the measures in place, and CBP takes a stance that you should already have these things in place before they ever get close to a U.S. border. But if you don't think that you're going to have all the evidence that you're going to require, then your best bet is to divert the shipment back to origin usually, especially as other countries start to institute similar rules. Diverting to another country may not be an option. Question: if a supplier has entities in Xinjiang but not on the UFLPA list, and there's no indication that raw material production is with forced labor, what are appropriate actions to prevent detentions? Going back to this slide here, I would assume that Customs is going to flag this shipment if it's coming from the Xinjiang province, particularly once they get the postal code requirements in. When that entry is filed, it's going to be flagged, and you're going to be asked to present clear and convincing evidence that meets these standards here, plus everything else within this document, to demonstrate that the goods are not produced with forced labor. and you're going to have to trace it back effectively to where the materials were taken from the ground. Those of you familiar with free trade agreement practices, that preference criterion A for NAFTA of old, where the goods are wholly produced of that origin, you can trace it back to the earth. That's the sort of tack you should be taking when considering whether or not you're able to demonstrate that the goods were not produced with forced labor, is if you can specifically identify each component and raw material, trace it all the way back to the point where it was taken from the earth. So if it's chemicals, where were those chemicals harvested from? What labs were they produced in? If they were mined, or if they're using metals, where were those metals mined? If it's machinery that you're purchasing from that XUAR region or from Xinjiang as part of that XUAR region, the tracing back all of the assemblies and sub-assemblies back to their raw material state when they were taken from the earth or produced. That's the standard that you're trying to meet. It's a very high standard. In my opinion, a focus on avoidance is probably the key strategy to ensure your goods are not being produced with forced labor at any stage of your supply chain. That means ensuring that you can account for and you can trace your goods thoroughly throughout your supply chain. And when you've got suspicion, you're able to take the steps to either confirm or reject that suspicion that you have. So if you're unsure, you need to treat that as and you're in that region, you're somewhere in that ballpark, you need to treat that as though you're going to be subject to the UFLPA, and you need to take steps accordingly. You want to be able to trace your entire supply chain. Following that guidance on that previous slide, it gives you some pointers on what you need to have in place, what sort of documentation you should be expecting, what sort of communication chains you should have open with your suppliers and with their suppliers in order to not run afoul of this forced labor provision. And you need to be able to tie back through several layers of supply chains depending on what your business type is. And lastly, there are some forensic testing services available out there. You can have chemical analysis performed on things like cottons and coffee beans and other products and materials. There was a company called FloraTrace that could do some of the testing, and several others. You can also have financial accounting audits and chains going back all the way through the entire production process, linking purchases to goods produced in terms of the quantities that were produced and the values they were produced for and who they were sold to and how they were shipped there, and be able to provide the shipping records for that movement, all the different pieces through a forensic accounting methodology. You can use those sorts of tools in order to be prepared. Remembering that there was Eric Choi, who was the director of trade remedy and law enforcement for CBP, was the guy that was credited as saying, it is incumbent on importers to do their supply chain due diligence before their cargo is detained. If you're starting the process after the goods have been detained, you're already too late. There's no way you'll be able to complete it correctly in 30 days. And it takes a thorough awareness and understanding that most U.S. businesses don't tend to engage in without good reason. It is a significant undertaking to trace your goods back to their source, to the origin. We're going to take a look at some of the tools and resources and strategies that are out there that you can tap into to hopefully create a customized solution that fits your business, that will help leverage some of what the world stage has really put out there to help you develop social compliance programs and position your business to shift with the coming changes and the awareness to forced labor. There is a social compliance system put out by the U.S. Department of Labor. It's an 8-step guide, has copious amount of resources, just different examples, different questions you should be asking about your supply chain, about your supplier network, lots of documents that you can download and review that will either provide you a guidepost to create your own version of a policy or a documentation step that you need to introduce into your supply chain, or at least provide you information about why those sorts of things are important. So it's called their Department of Labor Comply Chain, and it asks you to engage with your stakeholders and partners, assess the risks and impacts, develop a code of conduct, communicate and train across your supply chain, monitor compliance, remediate violations, and conduct independent review and report performance and engagement. These are, for those of you in trade compliance that have been here a while like me, these are very rudimentary, basic things that they're recommending here. But the amount of depth that this website actually goes into is very, very useful. So I would encourage you not to dismiss this. It looks, the red and blue and all that stuff, whoop-de-doo, but they're actually useful resources. And I was quite pleased that the Department of Labor had this out there. And it's a very smart place to start for developing your own social compliance system, the Department of Labor Comply Chain. The International Labor Affairs Bureau, also part of the Department of Labor, puts out the Better Trade tool, which integrates existing reporting by product type, including by HS codes, as well as the countries that are found to be using forced labor. So while the UFLPA is focused very specifically on the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the concept of forced labor and child labor and human trafficking extends well beyond just that one region. In fact, it's been known to happen here in the United States. There was a recent case about that in Kentucky. I forgot the exact spot where it was, but these things can happen everywhere, as I kind of stated at the top. This Better Trade tool allows you to cross-reference various regions and various countries with certain activities, and is a good place to start for if you're curious about the rest of your supply chain outside of Xinjiang or outside of China, and looking through what other red flags are out there that might exist. That Better Trade tool from the International Labor Affairs Bureau, part of U.S. Department of Labor, is very useful. And also the Responsible Sourcing tool from the Department of State in combination with Verite provides a forced labor risk mapping, country profiles, screening tools, compliance management strategies to avoid human trafficking, forced labor, including child labor, and other responsible sourcing risks. It's another great breakdown. It's a little bit cumbersome to navigate that site the first couple times, but once you know what you're looking for, you can zero in on exactly what sort of information you're trying to find that will help you create a profile for the places where you're currently doing business or with countries that you're interested in doing businesses with, help you identify which questions you want to be asking of your suppliers to get ahead of potential forced labor concerns and restrictions. These are good places to start for building out your awareness of your supply chain. And again, those of you in trade compliance understand the importance of having that firm grasp of what your supply chain is doing. And these are ways to get a little bit further ahead of the curve than you may be used to. Okay, lastly, some U.S. guidance on UFLPA and forced labor compliance. The DHS strategy to prevent forced labor imports is like a 60-page document. It's got the UFLPA entity list embedded in that document, but also they have their own website for that, which is the second link on the page. I highly recommend having both of those two in your back pocket. If you have any concerns, any active concerns or potential concerns with your existing supply chain, make sure you give the CBP operational guidance for importers a thorough review. My teams and I would be happy to help you kind of understand and apply it to your business, but in the context of a public webinar, it's kind of hard to do that. The CBP regional WROs and findings that are currently in place, not just for the XUAR, but for elsewhere around the world, is at that fourth link. And then the enforcement mechanisms, which I kind of touched on earlier on one of the slides. This is a way for you to get the regulatory citations on how to navigate through enforcement action from CBP under the UFLPA. And elsewhere on the slide, there are a couple of additional links that you can use to build out your awareness and understanding. These slides will absolutely be provided as a PDF that you can click on straight through to these links. That should all work. They'll be on our website in the next couple of days, probably. And you'll be able to kind of start digging into your supply chains. With that being said, I think that's the whole presentation for today.